Have you ever been treated like a criminal, just because you didn't look like everyone else? One late autumn evening, on Ashgrove Street, so ordinary no one even noticed it anymore, a 17-year-old black girl was stopped by police. Amira Daniels, still in her bakery uniform that smelled faintly of flour, only wanted to get home for dinner with her mom, but to them, she wasn't a good student, wasn't someone's daughter, she was just a suspect. A young black girl, walking alone, easy prey. "Just a quick check," one officer said, his voice smooth as a blade sliding across skin. The streetlight flickered. The patrol car door swung open. And, within minutes, the routine stop turned into a public execution in everything but name. Bystanders filmed on shaking phones. But who would dare step between 3 uniforms and a steel baton coming down? They thought they were teaching her a lesson in fear. They thought a skinny teenage girl would endure it in silence, like so many before her. What they didn't know was that Amira Daniels wasn't just any girl. And when she reached for her phone, her hands still trembling, they had no idea what that call would unleash, because the man on the other end wasn't a powerless father. He was someone the system itself couldn't blindfold. That night, Ashgrove slept, quietly holding its ugly secret. But the sun was about to rise, and with it, a truth no one could stop. They picked the wrong girl. You're watching Racist Exposed. If this story hits you, leave a like, share it so more people know, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The late autumn wind whipped through the bare trees along Oak Ridge Avenue, carrying the damp, moldy scent of decaying leaves and the hollow chill of a small town about to fall asleep. Amira Daniels pulled her hoodie tight, tucking her curls beneath the worn purple fabric. It was her favorite, a simple birthday gift that made her feel shielded from the world. After her shift at the diner, the smell of grease and fried batter still clung to the uniform stuffed in her backpack. Her hands were raw from hours of scrubbing dishes. All she wanted was to get home, have dinner with her mom and little brother, then sit at her desk and finish her essay, the one about her dream of becoming a lawyer, the dream she believed might one day save this town. Somehow. Oak Ridge Avenue wasn't memorable. A couple of dry cleaners, a thrift shop, a movie theater that had been closed since summer, but Amira knew every crack in the sidewalk, every flickering streetlight. She always thought this was the safest way home. Tonight, with the dim glow of the lamps stretching across the pavement, she realized safety was just an illusion. The low growl of an engine tore through the night a patrol car. The white and blue machine crept forward, slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking a fragile prey. Amira didn't turn around, but she felt the weight of eyes burning through the glass, fixed on her back. Every step felt heavier, like her shoes had been filled with lead. "Evening, miss." The voice dripped like honey, but tasted like poison. Sergeant Derek Voss, the name her mother had whispered once, full of warning. He drew out every syllable, as if his words were both an invitation and a command. "Mind stopping for a moment?" Amira stopped. The headlights hit her face, blinding her. She swallowed her fear, remembering her mother's instructions. Stay calm, be polite, and, if you can, record everything. Her thumb trembled as she swiped her phone and turned on the recorder. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice unsteady but clear, the kind of practiced calm born from years of knowing what survival required. Voss stepped out of the car. His massive frame cast a shadow across the sidewalk, swallowing the streetlight. His eyes didn't belong to a man performing his duty. They belonged to someone measuring just how far he could push his victim. The night on Oak Ridge turned heavy. That patrol car wasn't a symbol of protection anymore, it was a warning of what was coming. Amira knew that one wrong word, one wrong look, could spiral this into something she couldn't control. She tightened her grip on her phone, forcing her breathing to steady. Not just to protect herself, but to make sure, if something happened, the truth wouldn't die with her. When Amira stopped walking, it felt like the whole street stopped with her. The wind rattled the old store signs. A dog's nails clicked against the pavement. Even the yellow light from the laundromat across the street felt heavier somehow. She saw Mr. Chang, the frail old man who owned the dry cleaner, locking his door. He froze. Broom in hand, his shoulders stiff. His eyes found hers, but he didn't come closer. He leaned the broom against the wall, reached into his pocket, and quietly pulled out his phone. Farther down, a group of teenagers loitering outside the convenience store didn't say a word. They just pulled out their phones, raising them like shields, like witnesses who knew they couldn't intervene but could at least capture the proof. In the flickering glow of another streetlight, Amira spotted Mr. Howard, the elderly man who walked his dog every night. He had stopped, slow and stiff, as if his old bones could sense the danger too. The dog beside him let out a low growl, picking up on the tension in the air. Amira felt their eyes on her. They were like invisible arms, protective, but powerless. She thought of all the stories she'd read, the videos that spread online before vanishing. The accounts rewritten in cold police reports that labeled people like her as resisting arrest or disturbing the peace. Her mother's words echoed in her head. If you don't have evidence, the truth gets buried. It wasn't just advice. It was a survival code in this neighborhood. Sergeant Voss stood like a wall, blocking the way home. Behind him, a car door clicked. Another officer. "What's going on? Voss, a low," lazy voice called out. Amira didn't answer. She knew she was standing on a chessboard she'd never chosen to play on. All she could do was follow her mother's rules, stand tall, keep her voice calm, let the phone be her silent witness. Mr. Chang inched closer to the curb but didn't cross the street. The teenagers didn't move, their phones glowing faintly. Mr. Howard stood still, his dog's growl rumbling quietly. They were all there. They saw. But none of them could stop what was about to happen. The sound of a car door slamming snapped through the night. Amira knew what it meant. Her way home had been transformed into a stage one where law wasn't justice but performance. Another officer climbed out of the car, broad and quick, circling behind her, close enough for Amira to feel his breath on her neck, smell the stale cigarette smoke. "Nice backpack," he said casually, but the suspicion dripped off every word. "Looks expensive. How does a little diner worker afford that?" Amira wanted to tell him it was a birthday gift, but experience told her the truth wouldn't matter. Any answer would just be fuel for whatever story they wanted to write. She stayed silent, clutching the straps of her bag, forcing her breath to stay even. "Attitude like that," Voss sneered, "is called non-compliance." The streetlight reflected off the cracked pavement as another patrol car rolled up. Slowly, deliberately. Its door opened. A third officer stepped out massive, like a wall with legs. 3 minutes. That's all it had taken for a routine stop to become a trap. The silent witnesses along the street stayed frozen. Mr. Chang kept filming. The teenagers had stepped off the convenience store stoop, onto the sidewalk. Mr. Howard's dog growled louder, but no one stepped forward. Everyone knew one wrong move could trigger an explosion. "Failure to comply is a crime," Voss said, loud enough for everyone to hear. And then, like a line in a play, the second officer stumbled dramatically, deliberately, and hit the ground, his hand accidentally brushing Amira's. "She assaulted me," he barked. The world froze. Before Amira could even process what happened, Voss had pulled his baton. The metallic snap echoed like a gunshot. Crack. The first blow slammed into her shoulder. "Stop resisting," Voss barked, his voice ripping through the night. Amira curled in on herself, lowering her head, protecting her body as the baton came down again and again. Every strike, Every word felt like they were branding her with the lesson they wanted her to learn. This is what happens when you forget your place. On the cold, cracked sidewalk of Oak Ridge Avenue, Amira understood the law wasn't her refuge tonight. It was their weapon, and she was their target. The room stank of bleach, stale coffee, and the kinds of conversations that never made it into official reports. The ceiling felt too low, the flickering fluorescent lights casting a morgue-like pall over everything. Amira Daniels sat on a cold metal chair, bolted to the floor. Her wrists were locked together in steel cuffs, the chill of them seeping into her skin, crawling into her bones. Her split lip ached, the dried blood pulling tight with every small movement, a reminder of the batons, the kicks, the blows she'd endured only hours ago. The wall in front of her wasn't the dull gray she'd imagined. It was a one-way mirror. She knew there were eyes behind it watching, judging, but never accountable. The door swung open. Sergeant Derek Voss entered, his uniform as crisp as if nothing had happened on Oak Ridge Street. 2 more officers followed, one of them the same man who had fallen on the sidewalk to frame her. Now, he strolled in like an actor, ready for the next scene. "Body cameras malfunctioned today," Voss said flatly, as if reading a press release. He dropped a thin file onto the table in front of her, letting it fall open like a trap. "No footage, but we have statements." 3 officers. He paused, locking eyes with her. "And what do you have?" Amira said nothing. Every muscle in her body tensed as she fought to hold on to the only thing she had left her composure. Assaulting an officer, resisting arrest, disturbing the peace. The other officer recited the charges like a grocery list, each one stacked like bricks in the wall they were building to bury her. "I want a phone call," Amira said, her voice quiet but steady. Voss raised an eyebrow, like she'd just said something amusing. "A phone call? You think this is TV?" He glanced at his partners, and they chuckled under their breath. Amira stared at him. "I have the right to make a call." It was a simple sentence, but each word landed like a stone hurled at the fortress of power they thought was unbreakable. Behind the glass, maybe someone was listening. Maybe no one cared, but she still said it. In that moment, she wasn't the bruised girl they'd beaten on the street. She was a citizen demanding her rights, knowing they'd do everything they could to turn it into a joke. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Voss dragged a chair out and sat across from her. "One call," he said, his words hissing between clenched teeth. "But choose wisely. You'll need more than luck to get out of here." Amira sat up straight, her gaze unwavering, and in her mind, she already knew exactly who she'd call. The old department-issued phone was placed on the metal table, its screen cracked with a long diagonal line like a scar. Voss pushed it toward her, pretending it was a kindness, when really it was just another test to give her a little power. Watch what she did with it. "One call," he repeated, monotone now, like he was trying to read her next move. Amira's fingers trembled from pain, from restraint, but her touch was steady as she dialed the number she'd known by heart her whole life. Each beep stretched time, each ring pulling the moment taut like a wire, ready to snap. 2 rings. Then, "Amira, where are you?" The voice on the other end was deep and cold, like the sound of a vault door sealing shut. Amira's whole body loosened at once, the tension melting in the familiarity of it. Elias Daniels, her father. The man none of them in this room knew. The man these uniforms had no idea they were about to face. "Dad," she choked out, tears burning her eyes. I'm at the Ashgrove Police Department." Her voice cracked. "Are you hurt?" His question cut through, sharp and immediate. Not the voice of a worried father, the voice of a commander assessing damage. They beat me. On Oak Ridge Street, I didn't do anything. Silence. Not the kind that meant nothing, the kind that meant everything. Then his voice came back, cold and deliberate, every word a blade. Amira, stay silent. I'm on my way. She bit her lip, swallowing everything else she wanted to say. Just those 3 words were enough for her to understand everything was about to change. Voss chuckled, leaning back in his chair like he'd just watched a comedy sketch. Called your daddy, huh? Maybe he'll bring cookies and some good advice. Amira raised her head and met his gaze. Her eyes were still red, but the fear in them had burned away. She didn't answer. She didn't need to tell him that Daddy wasn't just any man. Amira Daniels was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a man who could drag an entire system to its knees for his daughter. Behind the mirror, someone shifted. Quick footsteps, muffled voices, low but tense. Maybe they were starting to realize this wasn't the game they thought it was. But in this room, Voss still believed he was in control. Amira set the phone down, leaned back, and exhaled. She didn't need to explain. She just had to wait. Because she knew when Amira Daniels said, "I'm on my way," the storm wasn't a promise. It was already coming. Voss laughed again. Short, hollow, the sound of knocking on an empty drum. FBI, he repeated, dragging out the letters like he could crush them under his tongue. Oh, should we be trembling? The other 2 smirked. One leaned toward Voss and muttered just loud enough for Amira to hear, "Maybe the big guy'll file a complaint." Terrifying. Amira didn't respond. Her eyes stayed on them, flat and calm, like a still lake before a hurricane. That silence unsettled them more than any words could have. One younger officer, still baby-faced under the uniform, finally blurted out, "What's your dad's name?" Amira didn't answer, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward. Not a smile. A warning. And in that tiny shift, they remembered the rumors they'd heard during training about a cold, relentless FBI director who didn't tolerate abuse of power. They couldn't be sure it was the same man. But the thought clung to them like a shadow creeping up their walls. Outside, the hum of traffic had gone still. Ashgrove seemed to be holding its breath. Voss rose, trying to reclaim his posture. "Lock her in here," he ordered. "Let's see what Daddy can do." But when he turned, Amira saw his hand clench, veins raised, knuckles white. That wasn't strength. It was defense. She sat there, shackled, feeling the weight of fear slide off her shoulders and onto theirs. The storm hadn't arrived yet. But they felt it. And Amira knew when it came, it wouldn't just shake these walls. It would tear them down. Ashgrove nights were usually as still as an old pond, disturbed only by wind threading through brittle trees or the occasional bark of a stray dog from the creaky wooden houses on the outskirts. But tonight, that stillness was torn apart by unfamiliar sounds, the steady growl of engines, the pounding rhythm of tires on cracked pavement, and bright beams cutting across the darkness. A convoy of black SUVs snaked through the narrow streets toward the heart of the town. Their tinted windows reflected the dull orange glow of the street lamps, hiding the faces inside. Ashgrove's residents pulled their curtains tight, peeking through slivers with pounding hearts, as though watching a storm crawl in from another world. They weren't used to this, a procession of vehicles that needed no permission to enter anywhere. The Ashgrove Police Department stood under its tired yellow lights like a smug little fortress. But before this convoy, it might as well have been a cabin waiting to be flattened. SUV doors swung open. Black boots hit the ground almost in unison. Federal tactical agents, armored vests bearing the gold-lettered insignia, moved with an unnerving precision that made the air itself thicken. They didn't waste words, only sharp, clipped commands cut through the thud of synchronized footsteps. A tall man led them. His stride carved a path straight through the station gate as though the place belonged to him. His face was hard, decisive, his gaze sweeping over everything, assessing, commanding in the same motion. Elias Daniels. He wasn't wearing the tailored suit of a federal official. He wore a charcoal overcoat, plain yet commanding enough to turn this night into an execution of power. Inside the interrogation room, Sergeant Derek Voss heard the front doors crash open, followed by the all-too-familiar shouts of colleagues being subdued. Cold sweat trickled down his neck. The two officers with him froze, their eyes darting like cornered prey. The door burst open. Two federal agents stepped inside, their voices ringing like the hammer of a gavel. "Drop your weapons! Now!" Voss opened his mouth to protest, but then Elias Daniels appeared behind them. He didn't shout. He just stood there, staring straight at Voss. That stare, cold enough to extinguish any thought of defiance, told him exactly who held power now. "This is a federal intervention," Elias said, each word sharp and deliberate. "You are all under investigation for excessive force and obstruction of justice. Cooperate or be cuffed where you stand." No one replied, but everyone understood the game they thought they were winning was over. In that moment, Derek Voss realized that tonight they weren't holding a girl in custody. They were the ones trapped in the eye of a storm that had just descended on Ashgrove. On the second floor of the station, the air was so dense it could be cut with a knife. Local officers were ordered to stand against the wall, stripped of their weapons, as the feds locked down every exit. The harsh white glow of the fluorescents bleached their faces, making them look like ghosts dragged out of guilty dreams. Elias Daniels stood in the center of the room, separated from everyone else. He didn't need to shout. His presence alone was enough to crush every sound against the tile floor. An agent handed him a phone, the data pulled from Amira's device. Elias didn't sit. He didn't need to. He stood there like a judge about to hear a final testimony. He hit play. The screen flickered, casting a cold blue light across his face. No one in the room breathed. Amira. On the frozen pavement of Oak Ridge Street. The footage shook slightly, but every detail was there. Her raised hand trying to shield herself, the baton slamming into her shoulder, her small frame collapsing, her scream drowned out by the repeated bark of "stop resisting" like some hollow incantation. Derek Voss's face twisted with rage, his boot driving into her side, blood splattering onto gray concrete. Another officer pinning her down, spitting words no official report would ever record. Elias watched it all, never once looking away. His broad hands clenched until his knuckles went white. When it ended, he stayed silent for a few more seconds. Then he spoke, not loudly, but enough to make the room tremble. "This is no longer an incident. This is a campaign." No one responded, but the words fell like a verdict. He turned to a young female agent nearby. "I want a full list of every officer on duty that night, every complaint filed in the last 10 years, and get the Department of Justice on the line now." Elias stepped up to Voss, looked him dead in the eye. That stare wasn't just a father protecting his daughter. It was a man long accustomed to deciding the fate of men like Voss. "Do you know," Elias said slowly, "every time a camera speaks, it doesn't just tell the victim's story, it strips the mask off the perpetrator. And this video will be heard in places you've never dared to set foot." Voss didn't answer, but his hand, still crusted with dried blood, trembled. Elias turned away, his voice cold as iron. "Tonight, the game ends." And every uniformed man pressed against the wall knew he wasn't bluffing. By dawn, the federal convoy rolled out of the Ashgrove station. Red and blue lights flared, then disappeared around the corner, leaving behind a town drowning in a silence heavier than the night's screams. Ashgrove's residents shut their doors, but their eyes stayed glued to phone screens, waiting for the video they knew existed. This wasn't about one girl anymore. It was the answer to a bigger question. Does justice still exist here? Amira sat wrapped in a thin blanket inside a temporary federal safe room. She still shivered. Her mind reeled, her body ached, but she clung to one thought. It was recorded. They couldn't deny it. The video was proof. It would protect her from their lies. Meanwhile, at a temporary federal office, Amira Daniels stood before a large monitor as the raw footage was uploaded to secure federal storage. He ordered duplicates sent to the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division. "No one buries this," he said, his voice firm, like a vow. But he underestimated his enemies. Less than 4 hours later, when Elias returned to check the system, the video was gone. Not a corrupted file, not a glitch. Wiped clean. Every trace scrubbed, like it had never existed. He immediately summoned the tech team. They shook their heads. It wasn't us. Someone got in, and they knew exactly what they were doing. As Elias scrambled to contain the breach, the next blow landed. Local TV stations broke a developing story. Anonymous sources have provided us video evidence. 17-year-old Amira Daniels, identified as a gang affiliate, attacked police officers during an incident last night. The screen showed a short, grainy clip enough to convince anyone who didn't know the truth. Amira lunging at an officer, her arm raised as if to strike. The footage cut out right before the violence began. No blood. No baton. No screaming. Just a troubled teen being subdued. Amira sat frozen, staring at herself on TV, but it wasn't her. It was the version they wanted the world to believe. "That's a lie," she whispered, clutching the blanket tighter. Elias stood behind her, his face dark. He knew now. This wasn't a cover-up. It was a full-scale operation planned, protected, and with one clear goal: to bury the truth beneath a better lie. The truth still existed, but it was in chains. And Elias Daniels understood if he wanted to save his daughter, he wasn't just fighting a handful of Ashgrove cops. He'd be going to war with the hands pulling strings in the dark. The real game of power had just begun. Morning in Ashgrove began with a silence so heavy it felt like lead. No children calling each other to school, no cheerful clinking from the corner bakery. Instead, the streets throbbed with the idle rumble of patrol cars parked in neat rows, and the metronomic thud of boots like the ticking of a clock in an invisible prison. When Amira pulled back her curtains, she didn't see her familiar neighborhood anymore. 2 officers stood at her gate, hands resting on their holstered guns, ready for an invisible threat, their faces cold and empty like living statues. Farther down, at the end of the street, a new checkpoint loomed, gleaming metal barricades blocking every vehicle in or out. Nobody explained anything. They didn't need to. Everyone understood Ashgrove was under lockdown. Amira's phone lay on the table, its screen black. She tried to connect, but the signal wheel just spun endlessly. No service, no Wi-Fi, no way out. The morning news was the final blow to any illusions left. According to a reliable source, the anchor droned, reading the words like a weather report. Amira Daniels, 17, is under investigation for gang-related activity. Sources say she assaulted officers during a routine administrative check. An old photo of Amira appeared on screen, darkened, edited, her eyes cold and unfamiliar, crafted to look like the face of a criminal. Not Amira, just a version of her built to justify the violence. Elias Daniels stood behind her, silent. He knew this playbook well: take the victim's story, rip it away, and replace it with one the public could swallow. Neighbors shut their doors. Mr. Chang walked past but didn't stop, leaving a grocery bag on their porch, a quiet message: "We're here, but we can't help you." Those who had filmed that night disappeared from the streets. They didn't need warnings to stay silent. They already knew what happens to anyone who steps off script. Amira turned to her father. "They're turning me into a monster," she rasped, voice raw from exhaustion. Elias placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "We haven't lost," he said, his voice low, steady. "But from now on, every step must be calculated. They don't just want to silence you, Amira. They want to erase even the idea that truth can exist here." Outside, the morning sun glinted off barricades and uniformed silhouettes, turning the small town into a prison without walls. Inside, Amira felt it in her bones. The real battle hadn't begun yet, but the darkness had already swallowed Ashgrove whole. By evening, sunlight thinned into a pale veil over the empty streets. From the living room window, Amira saw the same patrol cars still idling at the corner, their engines humming like guards that never sleep. The air felt compressed, as though the entire town was trapped in a sealed jar, waiting for someone to twist the lid. In the kitchen, Amira Daniels stood over the table, staring at his phone. He hadn't let it out of his sight since morning, knowing that when the people behind this wanted to speak, they'd choose a moment when he least expected it. And right on cue, as Ashgrove's street lamps flickered on, it rang. "An unknown number." He answered. "Mr. Daniels," a man's voice purred, smooth as if they were chatting over cocktails instead of making threats. "We know who you are, and we also know you think you can change things here." Elias didn't reply. He'd met plenty of men who wrapped knives in politeness. "This is our city," the voice continued, calm and unhurried. "It's been that way long before you or your family arrived, and it will stay that way if you know what's good for you." Elias put the call on speaker so Amira could hear. She stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. "You have a beautiful daughter," the man said, almost tenderly, a tone that made Amira's skin crawl. "She's in trouble, but all of this can disappear, like it never happened. All you need to do is walk away, take her out of Ashgrove, stay out of what doesn't belong to you." "And if I don't?" Elias asked, his voice low and steady. A pause, then a soft chuckle. "Then you'll see, here, the law is whatever we write it to be, and when necessary, we rewrite history too." The line went dead. Amira felt as if she'd swallowed ice. What? What will they do if you don't? Elias turned to her. His eyes didn't soften, but an ember burned deep inside them. "They want us scared. They want us to think this is all the power they have." He tightened his jaw. "But Amira, men who need to threaten to keep power are men already losing it." He squeezed her shoulder, a gesture that was both reassurance and a vow. "We're not leaving. If Ashgrove belongs to them, then it's time they prove it with something more than sweet words." Outside, street lamps lit up, casting harsh light over the motionless officers guarding the Daniels home. They looked like stone statues. But Amira knew behind them were hands pulling strings, hands that had started to feel the cracks forming in their wall of power. And those sweet words from earlier, just a mask to hide their growing fear. The next morning, a burnt smell clung to the air, so strong it made anyone opening their doors shudder. The news spread faster than the embers had died. St. Harmony Church, the heart of the community, had burned to the ground overnight. Amira stood on the curb with her father when they arrived. What had once been a bright sanctuary of stained glass and white arches was now nothing but a blackened skeleton, cracked walls, and columns of smoke clawing at the sky. Ash coated the steps where every Sunday the cleanest shoes in town once stood. Mother Ruth, 72, pastor and beating heart of St. Harmony, stood among the crowd. Her faded headscarf was singed on one side, her wrinkled face slick with sweat and tears. But her eyes that had witnessed too many seasons of injustice still blazed like fire refusing to die. A neighbor knelt, picking up a small wooden cross, charred and broken in half. Mother Ruth accepted it, holding it to her chest like a child. Tears streaked her cheeks, but when she spoke, her voice was iron. They can burn this church, but they cannot burn our faith. The crowd fell silent. Some bowed their heads, others nodded, as if her words were a rope pulling them back to their feet. Amira felt her father's grip on her hand tighten. It wasn't just grief, it was rage, wrapped and waiting for the right moment to ignite. Fire trucks still lined the street, firefighters combing through smoldering remains, but everyone knew they weren't there for answers, only to snuff out the last embers. Police stood nearby, faces blank, as though the blaze was just another item on their shift log. No arrests, no questions. "This is a message," a man muttered. Everyone understood. Burning the church wasn't just destroying a building. It was the powerful saying, "We can take even the place where you pray." Elias stepped toward Ruth. "We'll rebuild," he said, his voice low but unshakable. She nodded, clutching the charred cross. "We will, but we won't just rebuild walls and a roof. We'll rebuild this community. They want us on our knees. We'll stand taller instead." Amira watched Mother Ruth, a tiny woman, frail hands trembling but holding tight to that blackened cross, and she understood. If people like her hadn't fallen, neither could she. The ashes still smoked, but there, in the ruins, another fire had been lit. Not one of destruction, one of justice. The afternoon in Ashgrove was so heavy it felt like even the sky was bowing under the weight of what was happening. Amira sat in the living room, a cup of tea long gone cold on the table before her, untouched. Her father's voice drifted in from the kitchen, clipped words exchanged with the federal agents, punctuated by the scratch of pens and urgent instructions. But Amira's mind wasn't there. It spun in tight, dizzying circles around a single, unspoken question. Who out there can we still trust? A soft knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, Jade Morales stood there. Her hair was a tangled mess, eyes red-rimmed, her thin jacket hanging off one shoulder like she'd run all the way here. Before Amira could say a word, Jade stepped inside, hands trembling as if trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. "We need to talk," Jade said hoarsely. Amira crossed her arms, blocking the entryway. "About what? About how you disappeared when everything blew up? Or about how they got that fake video so fast it almost felt like someone handed it to them?" Jade collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "Amira, I did something terrible, but I didn't have a choice. They threatened my family." The room went silent, broken only by the ticking of Amira's mother's old clock. "What kind of threat?" Amira asked, her voice so cold it startled even herself. "Two men came to my dad's store," Jade said, clutching her jacket like it could shield her. "They talked about his unpaid debts, about our business license. Then they mentioned my brother. They knew he's applying for a college scholarship. They said, shame if his file just got lost." Amira felt her stomach twist. She knew that tone, the way power spreads fear, no shouting. Just a quiet reminder of everything they could take away. "So what did you do?" Jade couldn't lift her head. "I gave them information. Your schedule. Where you'd be. I thought, if I cooperated, they'd leave you alone. I thought I could control it." Amira stepped back as if struck. Jade, the girl she'd told all her secrets to, who'd sworn she'd always stand by her, had been the crack that let the enemy seep in. "You sold me out," Amira whispered. "I know." Jade finally looked up, tears streaking down her face. "And I regret it every minute, but I can't stand by while they make you the villain. I came here because I want to fix it, if you'll let me." Amira said nothing for a long time. In her eyes, anger and pain wrestled with the weight of old memories, sleepovers, secrets, promises. She wanted to scream, to throw Jade out, But another part of her whispered, what Jade knows might be the only way to turn this around. Finally, Amira spoke softly. If you really want to make this right, start by telling me everything. Every word they said. No more secrets. Not this time. Jade nodded, her small shoulders trembling. And in that moment, between betrayal and regret, a small light flickered the chance to turn guilt into a weapon against the very people who'd forced her to betray. Night had fully settled when the second knock of the day came. This one was different, sharp, deliberate, without Jade's hesitance. Elias checked the peephole, then opened the door. A tall, wiry man in plain clothes stepped in, eyes darting around as if expecting to be followed. "Evan Price," he said in a low voice, "temporary officer with Ashgrove PD. I'm here because I can't stay silent anymore." Elias blocked the door, his gaze cutting like a blade. "You know this isn't the house to visit if you're just here to play the hero." Evan nodded. "I know, but if you think the video in the evidence department will help you, you're playing the wrong game. What you need isn't there." Amira stepped forward, her pulse quickening. Then, where is it? Evan met her eyes. His face was young, but his gaze carried years of exhaustion, weighed down by things a man his age shouldn't have seen. All the videos, the internal reports, the disciplinary files, everything that could destroy this department, none of it's stored in the official system. Derek Voss keeps it. At his house. Elias crossed his arms, already calculating a personal server. "Exactly," Evan said. "A separate system, guarded like treasure. That's how he survived every investigation. If you want the truth, you'll have to get it from there." The air in the room thickened. Amira remembered Voss's smug expression in the interrogation room, the way he seemed untouchable. Now she understood why it wasn't just the badge. He had the whole town's secrets locked away in his pocket. "You sound like you know a lot," Elias said, eyes still fixed on Evan. "I worked a night shift there once," Evan replied. "Saw him hire someone to install the system off the books." He bragged. "If anything ever happens, this is my insurance." From the corner of the room, Jade spoke up, hugging her knees. "So, if we get that, we don't just save Amira, we can bring the whole network down." Evan nodded, his expression turning grim, but it won't be easy. His house is a fortress, 24-hour guards, cameras everywhere, passcodes rotated weekly. But if you want to flip the board, that's the only way. Elias looked from Amira to Jade to Evan. In that moment, he felt the weight of the choice before him: keep playing by the rules or break every one of them to pull the truth into the light. "You'll help?" Elias asked. Evan hesitated for a beat, then nodded firmly. "If I don't, then I'm just part of the silence." Amira clenched her fists. For the first time in days, she felt a fragile thread in her hands, a way to drag the truth out of the shadows. And she understood to beat Voss at his game, they'd have to play on his board. The Daniels' living room glowed dimly under the muted yellow of the street lamps outside. Everyone gathered around the wooden table: Elias, Amira, Jade, Evan, and Mother Ruth, who had insisted on being there when she heard Evan had information. She still wore her long charcoal dress, her thin hands resting on her cane like it alone held up her will. Evan spread out a large sheet of paper, a rough sketch of Voss's estate. He marked guard posts, camera angles, and a thin path along the back fence. "This is the only weak point," he said. 15 minutes between shift changes. During that window, one camera loses its sweep. That's our entry. Jade leaned forward, dark circles under her eyes. "I can handle the encryption. It's offline, but if I get into the server room, I can pull the data. Fast and quiet." Amira stared at the map like it was the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong step meant no way back. "This isn't just about evidence," she said, her voice tight. "This is walking straight into his lair." Mother Ruth gripped her cane and nodded. "Exactly. And that's why I call this..." She paused, letting her eyes travel across each face, a holy madness. Jade blinked. Holy? Because it's a desperate act to protect the truth, Ruth said, her voice low and steady, like a prayer. If no one does this, they'll rewrite history. And one day, even we'll believe their lies? Elias folded his arms, his gaze sharp as a blade on the paper. It sounds cleaner than it is. That house is built like a military bunker. I won't let anyone go without a solid exit plan. We'll have one, Evan replied. A car waiting in the woods behind the estate. If we're spotted, split up and run. But if we do it right, no one will know we were ever there. Amira swallowed hard. And if we're caught? The room fell silent. No one spoke the words, but they all knew the answer. Mother Ruth broke the stillness. This isn't work for the safe. Justice has never been won by those who stayed outside. If you're afraid, remember St. Harmony. It's ash now, but our faith hasn't burned. Amira looked at her, feeling a strange strength rising in her chest. Not bravery acceptance. No one was coming to save her. If she wanted freedom, she'd have to fight for it. Okay, she said, her hands tightening into fists. We do it. And there, in that small living room, they forged a plan, reckless, dangerous, maybe even doomed. But it was the only way to drag the truth into the light. The night in Ashgrove was blanketed by an unnatural stillness, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for whatever was about to happen. No one but them knew what was coming, and no one but them understood that if they failed tonight, every door would slam shut forever. Evan Price led the way, each step deliberate along the narrow trail behind Derek Voss's estate, dressed in dark clothes with a small backpack strapped tightly to his back. He moved like a shadow. Before leaving the Daniels house, he'd repeated it at least 10 times. Tonight isn't an action movie. There are no heroes, only silence and precision. Amira followed close behind, clutching a tiny USB drive, a scrap of plastic that felt as heavy as her own life. This would hold everything they needed: the original video, sealed reports, and the evidence to drag an entire corrupt network into the light. Jade trailed them, holding her laptop tight to her chest like a talisman. She hadn't spoken a word since they left, but Amira could feel the tremors in her friend's shoulders. They'd walked dark Ashgrove streets before after late-night shifts, but tonight every step felt like treading on a blade. They stopped at the tree line overlooking the estate. Through the branches, Amira saw white searchlights sweeping slowly across the sprawling lawn, reflecting against the towering walls. Voss's house loomed like a fortress in the dark gray-tiled roof, glowing windows, guards moving with the precision of a machine. Evan held up his hand. 10 minutes until the shift change. That's when the rear camera loses coverage. That's our window. His whisper was barely louder than the night insect's hum. Amira took a deep breath, forcing her heart to slow. She thought of Mother Ruth's words. If no one does this, they'll rewrite history. Those words kept her planted here instead of running back to safety. Jade opened her laptop, connecting it to a small homemade device. Once we're close, I can scramble the secondary feed for 5 minutes. No more. 5 minutes is all we need, Evan said. When the clock struck the shift change moment, Evan signaled. They crouched low, running across the grass like phantoms. The smell of damp earth and wild plants clung to Amira's lungs, but she didn't stop. At the wall, Evan unfolded a compact ladder hidden in the bushes. He scaled it like a cat and pulled Amira up. She passed the USB to Jade before climbing, handing over a piece of her soul. When all three landed in the backyard, Amira felt it in her bones this wasn't a game anymore. This was the night the prey bit back. The side door to the basement opened so easily it made her shiver. No tools, no alarms, just a soft click, like it had been waiting for them. Too easy, Evan muttered, scanning the dark hallway. Jade crept in first, the laptop's glow casting an eerie green on her tense face. "Server rooms at the end of this hall," she whispered, pointing at the layout she'd memorized. "Small room, digital lock, but I can crack it." Amira brought up the rear, palm slick against the USB. Every step on the creaking wooden floor sounded like a drumbeat to disaster. At the server room door, Jade knelt, pulling out her codebreaker. 3 minutes, she murmured. "Give me 3 minutes." Evan stood guard, one hand on his holster, ears tuned for any sound. Amira kept her eyes on his back, clinging to the illusion that Evan knew exactly what he was doing. A soft beep. Jade exhaled. "Got it." She pushed the door open. The lights blazed on, not the sterile white of a server room, but blinding yellow from floodlights that swallowed them whole. "Run," Evan barked, but the gunfire drowned him out. Amira saw Evan jerk violently, blood splattering the wall. Jade screamed, her laptop crashing to the floor. Figures burst from the shadows, black uniforms, masked faces, rifles raised. She didn't think. Instinct took over. Amira ducked and bolted down the narrow corridor, feet pounding the floor. Jade's screams echoed behind her, tearing at her, but the gunshots shoved her forward. An exit door glimmered ahead, a fragile promise. Amira slammed her shoulder into it. It burst open. She tumbled onto the wet grass. The night air slapped her face. Darkness of the forest wrapped around her like a shroud. But behind her, yellow beams slashed the ground, and shouts followed. "Get her!" Amira ran. She didn't look back. Branches whipped her face and arms, but she felt nothing, only the thunder of her own heart, tangled with the barking of dogs and the pounding of boots behind her. She forced herself to think of one thing. The truth is still in there. Evan was down. Jade could be captured. But if she stopped, everything ended. Branches snapped underfoot. She kept running, a ghost fleeing hell, clutching a flicker of fire, the will to survive, and to drag the truth out of the trap that had swallowed them. She didn't know how long she ran. Her legs turned to lead, every step dragging her closer to collapse. Branches tore her skin. The cold wind lashed her face like whips. When her body finally gave up, she crashed into a hollowed tree, collapsing inside, gasping, chest burning. She didn't dare cry. A sob could bring them to her, but her throat burned, as if she'd swallowed flames. The pain in her right leg sharpened when she looked down a deep gash, blood soaking her jeans. She must have hit metal when she burst out the door. The forest was quiet, but not peaceful. It was listening, watching. Far off, flashlights swept the darkness, dogs barked, footsteps stalked like predators tracing a wounded animal. Amira pulled out her phone. The cracked screen flickered weakly. She didn't have the strength to call or the time to explain, and she didn't need to. With trembling fingers, she opened a message and typed a single word. "Betrayed." She hit send to her father. In that moment, a strange feeling washed over her despair and relief, tangled together. Sending that message was the last thread tying her to the outside world, to the one man who could turn the tide. She closed her eyes, picturing Amira Daniels reading it. He would understand. He always did. One word was enough. The plan was blown. Evan could be dead. Jade could be captured. And the truth they'd risked everything for was still in the enemy's hands. Bushes rustled nearby. Amira held her breath, pressing herself into the hollow like she could disappear into the tree. A flashlight beam swept past, paused. Her heart stopped, then moved on. Footsteps faded. She exhaled in shallow bursts, the pain in her leg mixing with a strange floating exhaustion. But she couldn't pass out. If she slept, It could be forever. She thought of Mother Ruth's words. If no one does this, they'll rewrite history. She thought of Jade and Evan, their blood and terror spilling for this cause. The phone in her hand weighed her down, kept her awake. That single word wasn't just a warning for Elias. It was a declaration of war. In that hollow tree, surrounded by darkness and the smell of her own blood, Amira promised herself, "Tonight I am prey. But when the sun rises, I'll be the hunter." Morning in Ashgrove looked like a stage play. From early dawn, television vans lined Main Street, antennas raised high, cameras aimed at the old city hall draped in multicolored banners reading, "Healing Our Community." At the steps, guards stood stiff, bulletproof vests gleaming in the sunlight. The outward picture was dialogue and unity, but every brick in this place still reeked of fear and blood from the days before. Mayor Walter Bixby appeared before the crowd like an actor slipping into costume. A gray suit hugged his overweight frame, his smile rehearsed to perfection. He strode up to the podium with the confidence of a man convinced he'd written the script for everyone. "We are here today not to divide, but to heal," he said, his voice even, as if the recent violence and lies were nothing more than a passing storm. Amira stood at the back of the room, her hood pulled low, her heart pounding like a war drum. She hadn't told anyone about the nightmare at Voss's mansion that Evan had been shot, that Jade might be in custody, that she had fled with bloodied legs. Not because she feared her father would stop her, but because she knew everything would end if the truth wasn't exposed today. The stage lights made the hall glow, but Amira only saw the people in the front row. Bixby, with his pre-written speech. Voss, uniform crisp as if he'd never been challenged. And several other officers, faces like stone, eyes sweeping the crowd as if this were just another routine meeting. The crowd was different. Ashgrove's residents filled the rows, mostly silent, a few whispering to one another, as if gathering the courage to exist in a room where power still sat smug and unshaken. Some held hastily made wooden signs, "Justice for Amira," and "No more lies." Mother Ruth was there too, in the third row, her old eyes sharp and undimmed by fear. Bixby droned on about faith in the system, about giving each other a chance to make amends. His words sounded like honey but landed cold as stone. Amira knew he wasn't speaking to the people. He was speaking to the cameras, to the distant audience who would see Ashgrove through a lens, not through the smell of ashes or the sting of sealed doors. Her hand clenched the USB in her coat pocket. It burned hot, reminding her that every false word here would crumble once the truth was unleashed. No one knew she was here. No one knew that, in just a few minutes, she would shatter the script Bixby and Voss had written so carefully. She took a breath, glanced at Mother Ruth, then fixed her gaze on the massive screens flanking the stage. Those weren't just tools of propaganda. They were about to become her weapon. Amira told herself it's time to flood this room with the truth. She slipped along the wall, weaving through the cramped rows. No one noticed the small hooded girl vanishing into the crowd. In the back hallway, Jade Morales was waiting, her face drawn but her eyes burning like someone standing on the right side for the first time. "You still want to do this?" Jade asked, voice shaking but firm. "Too late to turn back," Amira said. They moved silently through the corridor to the control room. The heavy door was poorly latched, a careless mistake by people who thought they couldn't be challenged. Jade pushed it open. The dim room glowed with the light of monitors. Two techs sat inside, focused on the broadcast feeds. Jade stepped forward, pulling from her pocket a stolen access card, one she'd swiped during her summer internship here. A soft beep confirmed access. The auxiliary system unlocked. 30 seconds, she whispered. Amira handed her the USB. Her hand was ice cold but clenched so tightly her nails left marks on her skin. "Everything's on there," she said, her voice catching in her throat. Jade plugged it in. The monitors blinked external device detected. Files appeared not doctored clips, but the raw footage they had risked their lives to steal from Derek Voss's fortress. On stage, Mayor Bixby dripped sweet poison. "We need peace. We need to leave the past behind us." Jade pressed enter. A strange hush. Then, the big screens behind the podium flickered, cutting from the program's logo to a shaky but unmistakable image, Amira, slammed onto the Oak Ridge pavement. The audio boomed the sharp crack of a baton hitting flesh, the barked, "Stop resisting the crying," tangled in chaos. The entire hall froze. Bixby spun, his face drained of color. "Turn it off," he barked, but the techs were too stunned to move. The video rolled on Derek Voss, his face twisted with rage, driving his knee into the side of the small girl curling up to protect her head. Every blow, every degrading word, echoed through the hall's speakers. The crowd murmured, then erupted. Someone shouted, "That's the girl they framed." Mother Ruth rose to her feet, her voice ringing like a bell. "Look, this is the truth they tried to bury." Amira looked up at the screen, her heart pounding, but her legs steady. She saw herself being beaten, but she also saw Ashgrove, trampled and silenced. A cop burst into the control room. Jade stood in his path, hands trembling but unyielding. "Touch this computer, and you're touching an entire city watching right now." In the hall, the murmurs became shouts. The reversal had worked, and Amira knew from this moment no one could drag the truth back into the dark. The hall roared like a dam breaking. Lies that had rotted for so long were stripped bare before everyone's eyes, and the anger that had been caged for too long poured out. "They beat that girl and built a lie. This is your justice." Mayor Bixby stumbled back, his face crimson but his eyes frantic. "Calm down," he shouted, but no one was listening. Derek Voss rose from the front row, trying to regain control with his familiar bark. "Sit down, all of you." Something flew at him, cutting his words short. Mother Ruth's wooden cane. She stood in the third row, a small figure with blazing eyes, her voice thunderous. "Enough? This isn't your town anymore." The crowd ignited. They surged forward, shedding the fear that had chained them for so long. A group of older women, once dismissed as weak and harmless, formed a line at the podium. One swung a heavy purse into a charging officer, staggering him. Another aimed straight at Voss, slamming her bag into his chest with surprising force. "Get out of Ashgrove," someone screamed, and the chant echoed, growing louder and louder. Evan Price, his leg bandaged, hobbled in on crutches, stepping between Voss and the crowd. Sweat dripped from his brow, but his voice cut through the chaos. "It's over, Derek. You're not walking out of here, not this time." Voss snarled, "You'll pay for this betrayal." Evan smirked faintly. "I'd rather be called a traitor than stay a silent coward." An officer lunged, but the crowd held their ground. Men who had once been silent now stepped forward, forming a human wall between the police and Amira, between the old power and those reclaiming their voice. Voss tried to escape, but the circle of women closed in. It was almost absurd, the once feared man now cornered by grandmothers with heavy bags and unflinching resolve. He shouted, but each swing of a cane, each curse from weathered lips drove him back step by step, until there was nowhere left to go. From her corner, Amira watched it all, her heart threatening to burst. She no longer saw herself as the victim in that video. She saw herself as part of this crowd, these people who had decided they would bow no longer. The hall that had been a stage for propaganda and manipulation was now a battlefield for justice. And in that chaotic, glorious moment, the truth wasn't just on the screens. It was alive, breathing in every scream of the people taking their town back. Dawn in Ashgrove didn't look like any morning before. The first light broke through a thin veil of fog, falling over City Hall now stained with spray-painted slogans from the night before "Justice lives here." On the steps, the same people who had once been forced into silence now sat in small clusters, speaking in hoarse but determined voices. A convoy of black SUVs rolled slowly down the main street. Unlike the secretive entrances of days past, this time they arrived in the open, in broad daylight. The doors opened, and federal agents stepped out, armored vests glinting in the morning sun, warrants in hand. Amira Daniels walked among them, his posture straight, his movements calm, as if he had never once left his place. But Amira saw in his eyes the storm that had passed and a resolve not to let it return. Inside the hall, Mayor Walter Bixby and Derek Voss were led out in handcuffs, their faces stripped of the confidence they once wore like armor. Bixby still tried to speak, his voice breaking. "This is a huge misunderstanding, I demand." A federal agent cut him off, reading him his rights in front of the news cameras that had gathered. Voss said nothing. He only stared at the floor, as if unable to accept that the same hands that once gripped this town's throat were now shackled in cold steel. One by one, other senior officers, the so-called untouchables, were escorted out as well. They walked past the gathered citizens of Ashgrove, who stood silently watching. No booze, no thrown bottles, just a heavy silence, the kind born from years of suffering. Now, witnessing justice arrive late, but not diminished. Mother Ruth climbed the steps, her familiar wooden cane in hand. The crowd parted for her. She looked around, her old eyes blazing with a strength no fire could burn away. "Last night, we reclaimed our voices," she said, her tone quiet but carrying across the square. "But justice isn't just about arresting these men. It's about rebuilding this town so our children will never have to live through what we endured." An agent handed Elias a microphone. He read an order from the Department of Justice. Amira Daniels was reinstated as director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, tasked with personally overseeing the full investigation into Ashgrove's corruption network. The crowd erupted in applause not for his title, but because they knew someone would now guard their truth. Then came another announcement: Ruth would serve as Ashgrove's interim mayor. Cheers thundered. Those who had worshipped at St. Harmony wept, not from grief, but because hope had risen from the ashes. Amira stood beside her father, watching it all, and understood this collapse wasn't the end. It was a foundation, one on which Ashgrove could finally become the town it was always meant to be. A week later, Amira stood on the white stone steps of the National Memorial for Justice. Behind her, steel columns engraved with names of countless victims hung like silent shadows, witnesses of history. The morning was cold, but blazing with light, the sun reflecting off the memorial and the faces of thousands gathered below. They had come from everywhere, the people of Ashgrove, activists, students, families of victims whose stories had echoed briefly through the nation before fading into silence. Amira clutched the folded paper of her speech in her hand, but she knew she wouldn't read it. As the applause dimmed, she stepped up to the microphone. Her hands still bore unhealed scars, but her voice was new, no longer trembling, no longer begging to be heard. "They wanted me silent," she began, her voice steady, each word striking the walls built around every heart listening. "They wanted me buried beneath their lies, turned into a story convenient for them to tell. But I—" She drew a deep breath, her eyes locking on the front row where her father sat with Mother Ruth and Jade. "I come from a people who do not bow." Applause roared, but she raised her hand, asking for quiet. "The day they beat me on Oak Ridge Street, I thought it was the end," she continued. "I thought if I stayed silent, it would pass, but I was wrong. Silence doesn't end the nightmare. Silence feeds it." Her gaze swept the crowd, landing on faces she didn't know but whose pain she recognized. "I know some of you here have lost family to violence, to power abused. I don't stand here as a beaten girl or a victim of their lies. I stand as living proof that we can turn fear into strength. A cold wind swept through, but no one moved. They were bound to her words. They burned our church. We rebuilt it. They built walls of lies. We tore them down with truth. And if they thought they could make Ashgrove bow, then today, by our presence here, we say no. The applause broke like thunder, long and rolling like waves crashing against the shore. Amira stood still, letting it wash over her, not as personal praise, but as a collective declaration the truth would no longer be caged in darkness. When the sound faded, she finished, "If you're listening today, and you're as afraid as I once was, remember this: you are not alone. We come from people who never learned to bow, and we are not starting now." She stepped back from the podium, her shoulders square. Knowing she had done more than tell her story, she had lit a torch for others to rise. The ceremony ended, but no one hurried to leave. People gathered in small clusters beneath the steel columns, exchanging hugs, handshakes, and stories they had carried in silence for too long. An older man told Amira he'd lost his son in an incident like hers. A young student from another state promised to start a campus group to fight for justice. These stories wove together, forming a quiet, unstoppable current. Amira walked to the open courtyard behind the memorial. Afternoon light poured over the engraved steel columns, making them glimmer like gold. She laid her hand on one cold surface, reading the names people who never had the chance to tell their stories. Elias came up beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did well," he said, "not as an FBI director, Dani, but as a father watching his daughter grow through the storm." Amira nodded, but her eyes stayed on the names. "I spoke, but I'm still scared, Dad. Scared this is just a brief light, and the darkness will return." Elias sighed. "The darkness always returns, but so do we, and this time we're not alone." She turned to look at him. Inside her, fear and resolve braided together into something new, a reminder that this path would never be easy, but it was worth walking. She glanced back at the now empty podium, standing alone on the stage. The seats were thinning, but she knew her words were still moving on TV, online, in conversation sparked by those who had watched her stand and speak. She drew a breath, whispering softly, as if asking herself but also everyone who would hear her story. What will you do when you see injustice? Turn away and let it continue as if nothing happened, or stand up and say no more? The question hung in the air, needing no immediate answer. It belonged to every listener, to every eye that had seen injustice and stayed quiet, to every heart that had been strangled by fear. Amira stepped down the memorial steps, merging into the crowd, leaving the grounds. But she knew in that moment what had happened in Ashgrove would not be buried like hundreds of forgotten stories. It would live as a warning, as a promise. And as the afternoon sun stretched across the path leading away from the memorial, her question lingered in every heart. When will we finally be brave enough to say no more? If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.